Alrighty, nerddom, welcome back to another comic review video. Today I'm feeling Frank Miller-ish at the moment, what with the release of Dark Knight 3 Master Race this last month, and then there's going to be a number of more coming up. I thought we would dive a little bit into one of my favorite works from Frank Miller, which is Absolute Ronin. This bad boy right here. I have talked about Frank Miller before. He was my first video ever was a Frank Miller penned book, written book, Life and Times of Martha Washington in the 21st Century. And I came to the conclusion, well, you could watch the video if you'd like to know exactly what I said, but it was interesting to me, but not my favorite thing in the world. If you look at Frank Miller, I propose, and I think that this is something that a lot of people think, that you could basically break his career down to 4 stages at this point, up until 2015. His first phase would be the mid to late 70s, where he worked at Marvel as a freelance penciler. He worked on some issues. I know of John Carter, I talked about that before, John Carter, Warlord of Mars. And then, most famously, he went on to pencil Daredevil and eventually take creative control of Daredevil and become the writer and the penciler. So that is sort of his formative years, in my opinion, was sort of 1976 or so through 1980 something. And then we get into the second era of Miller, which is my personal favorite, and I think when he was just hitting everything right on. That's from about 1982, 83, up until, I would argue, around 1988, 9-ish. So in that time period, he released Ronin, The Dark Knight Returns, and he also wrote Batman Year One. So that was a time when Miller was writing and drawing in his own style and was really, really crushing a lot of the stuff that he was working on, especially taking the Batman stories and making them a lot more serious and intense and dark and political and all the different things that Batman Dark Knight Returns is known for. One day I'm going to cover that book, but I need to reread it to sort of get a big chunk of my memory of it refreshed. And then after that, we move into the third period of Miller, which is sort of his writing period, I think, in the 90s, where he did a bunch of sort of late 80s through the 90s. He wrote 2 stories that Jeff Darrow did for Dark Horse, Big Guy and Rusty the Boy Robot, or I think that's the name of it, and Hard Boiled. He also wrote The Life and Times of Martha Washington, like I was saying, a number of different series like that. And he was also working during this time on his own Sin City book. So that was sort of the third period. And then I would say the fourth period starts with the publication of 300, which I believe was in 1999. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. But 1999 up until about, now, he did 300, Holy Terror. He was working, I think, on Sin City through some part of the early 2000s, but I'm not really sure. But it was a time where and he also did Dark Knight Strikes Again, whatever it was called, and All-Star Batman and Robin. He wrote that. These books are all sort of mixed in their reception. A lot of times people think that his storytelling and his art has really gone downhill and become a caricature of itself. It's very brash, and sort of everything that he was doing really well and making a point with that stuff in the 80s, it kind of folded in on itself and has become less interesting and maybe has not adapted with the times as much as people would have liked it to. So that, I would say, lasted up until about 2015, when we are poised right now for a Miller-sance. I think we're ready for it. Frank Miller is doing the Dark Knight 3 with Brian Azzarello and a few other people on art. And I think his name has a lot of excitement behind it again. Depending on how Dark Knight 3 turns out, I think there's a chance that he will keep writing stuff for DC, and it's going to be, a new age of people getting into him. But as of right now, this day, December 2015, this is how sort of I understand Frank Miller in these 4 sort of disparate phases of his creative career. As I said earlier, Ronin comes at the time that I find to be most rewarding to read his material. This book is from I believe, it was either 82 to 83 or 83 to 84. I don't remember. I want to say it was 83 to 84. So it was a year or two before he was doing Dark Knight Returns, and it was a little bit before he was writing Batman Year One, but it was after he had done the Daredevil stuff during which he had introduced a lot of things about ninjas and the samurai code of ethics. And so Ronin is sort of born out of his development and further delving into his interest in the samurai code and the wandering samurai, the masterless samurai, the title Ronin. It is so fascinating because I think it is really almost like, it reads almost like a thesis of Frank Miller's work, if that makes any sense. If you parse this apart, as I'm going to soon, you'll see all of his different influences, you know, separately laid out and then also coming together to form his own style. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I'd like to try filming the book itself in a more visually entertaining or at least informative way. So we're going to cut after this intro to the actual book where I go through and parse it apart. But I just wanted to give you guys that background that I had done and sort of tell you about a little bit about Frank Miller and a little bit about Ronin and where it fits in. So Ronin, as I said, was published in the mid-early 80s, 83 to 84. It was originally, actually, I just read, going to be, or was intended to be part of the Marvel graphic novel series, which was something that Marvel was doing to sort of give creators a little bit of freedom to do things like Walter Simonson's Star Slammers was one of the Marvel graphic novels. New Mutants, I know, was one of them famously. A bunch of different lines like that. But at the time, Miller was going to publish it like that, but DC came to him, or he came to DC, whatever the happenstance ended up being, and they basically said, we want to get you, you know, it would be a big grab for DC to get the guy who was so celebrated on Daredevil. We want to get you to publish this series. We're going to give you complete creative control over this, and it's going to be, you know, one of our premier style books. So like Camelot 3000, which I had talked about earlier, this was like one of DC's first like premiere styles where they printed it on thicker paper stock. It was a double-sized issue in the sense that it was twice as long as normal issues. So it's a 6-issue miniseries, which each one is 48-ish pages, 50 pages instead of the normal 22 to 25. So you're basically looking at the content of around 12 issues. So essentially a graphic novel in similar size to something like Watchmen or another, or any of those other kind of like V for Vendetta, any of those like similar in length. And this right here that I have is the Absolute Edition. I picked this up. It's relatively cheap to pick up right now. It's about, I think the cover price is I believe $100. Yep, but you could get this online for about $55 to $60, and it's also available in a number of other formats. There's a regular trade paperback, and as well as a deluxe edition. So if you're looking for oversized pages, but you're not really ready to commit to the absolute thing, you can definitely go for a deluxe edition instead. It's a really beautiful book. That's Miller's artwork from the original Ronin series, and then this is Miller's sort of adaptation of it now. You can definitely see the exaggeration in the body proportions and stuff. Sort of some things that people have come to not love so much about the way Miller draws these days. And then it has the Absolute Ronin on the side, on both sides. It's just really, really well put together. And the book itself is totally gorgeous. It has the artwork from the original series. And then if we slide it off, it has a really, really nice boards on there as well. So absolutely, oh, and then there's the little card that comes with it. So an absolutely beautiful series, one of my favorites. And when we get into breaking down the art, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the influences that Miller had on this and how you can see where they come together to form his total creative vision of Ronin. Alrighty, friends and viewers, I have taken the liberty of moving myself to this side of the camera, hopefully with the intent of breaking up the monotony of always looking at me just talking, and hopefully trying to show some of the things that I'm talking about with these books without me having to hold up all of the large hardcovers and everything for you all the time. So we shifted our view here, and we're going to look through Ronin while I give you my thoughts about the book. As you can see, the cover here, which I just mentioned a second ago, really nicely done. Ronin was done in a time for Frank Miller, like I said, the early 80s, where he was not, when he was doing this book specifically, he was not working with Klaus Janson, or however you would properly say his name, like he would with Dark Knight Returns, and I believe Janson or however, inked his Daredevil work as well. So this was more along the style, as I mentioned, along like Sin City, something like that, where Miller was really penciling and inking and writing everything on his own. So it is sort of this unabashed creative spurt from him controlling basically all the inputs to it. The only other contributor to this is Lynn Varley, who I don't know if she was they were married at the time. I don't believe so, but she basically did colors for this, and she hand painted all of the color work. So there's a lot of beautiful large spreads, specifically like chapter gaps and stuff like that, where there's really nice, beautiful hand painted stuff, and in scenes like this where you can see Miller has a very I don't know what I would call it exactly. It's sort of rough and sometimes angular, and it really like conveys a lot of power and only the lines and the work that it needs to convey, if that makes sense. A lot of his stuff is not over rendered. It has a very utilitarian approach to it. So the painting that Varley does on this really highlights a lot of that nicely. So I'm going to go through a lot of this. I'm not going to go through it, piece by piece and spoil the story for you all, but basically my interpretation of it and why I think Ronin is such a really interesting piece is that it basically captures the two disparate influences that Miller has in the beginning and sort of middle, and then by the end has turned into the Miller style that we know now. The book flips between a ancient Ronin, a Japanese samurai, and a modern, well, not modern, a futuristic city, New York megalopolis kind of deal with a like a large science tech building, weapons conglomerate thing being built, and it focuses on the Ronin, sort of displaced from time after being cursed, and this man in the future who has a some type of ESP mental ability to interface and operate machinery and stuff around him, and sort of their two destinies become intertwined, and they go through this journey together. And the other principal characters are mostly from the future, where they are other people who are working at the tech research lab, and the security guard, who is the woman that is seen in a lot of this. And basically, it's sort of displacing this Ronin into the future and seeing how he would kind of, the warrior spirit would deal with this, like, technological and corporational evil in the future of New York. So getting right into it, the early stuff is very much based in feudal Japan, and like I was saying, this really shows a lot of influence from Goseki Kojima, the artist of Lone Wolf and Cub, which Frank Miller has frequently stated is his favorite piece of comics work. So especially if you look at the way the combat panels are laid out and stuff, it is really, really a beautiful homage to Kojima's work. Like this kind of stuff is what I'm talking about. This is really nicely done, and it has these kind of breaks where he's using like white space and non-paneled areas to show the action, and then you get these kind of like cinematic cuts of it where you'll see this fight happening, but it's not like you're seeing the entire fight. It's not like it's pulled back and you're seeing this whole thing happen. You're getting like a slice from one person's view, a slice from the other person's view, the actual encounter, and then sort of the aftermath. So it's done in this highly cinematic and really like manga influenced art style. If you look at manga, especially a lot of the samurai stuff and a lot of the action manga, it is very, very, very kinetic with the way it sort of portrays its action. Like it has probably fewer transition shots like this. It kind of gives you these flashes and pieces, but it manages to maintain this amazing amount of energy. So this particular stuff at the beginning, like I was talking about, is I think highly influenced by Kojima and his work with Lone Wolf and Cub specifically. So when you're seeing kind of book one and the early Ronin, I would say that's where you're seeing Frank Miller's influences from Japan, where he's going and looking at this art style and sort of adapting it into his own thing. Now, if you move forward a bit into the kind of second and third chapters of Ronin, you start to get the real Mobius influences, I think. The style of the European, Belgian, and French comics that Miller was also consuming, where you're getting these kind of... It's hard to describe, but it's like the way that he crosshatches and highlights certain things, and the way that his character designs are laid out. It really, really feels like it references the kind of the fluidity and the looseness of Mobius in the way that it is rendering these kind of things that are fantastic or otherworldly or surrealistic, perhaps, like all of these, the machinery, and it's not really clearly defined machinery. It's just sort of this amorphous, like almost living machinery and stuff, and the way the characters are put together. It really feels to me like it has a very Mobius and French, Drouillet and the guys that were working on these kind of super imaginative and spacious designs for different science fiction or fantastic elements. It feels like Miller's channeling that into his, futuristic New York, where he has all of these bright colors. Obviously he didn't color it, but the style that Varley was painting over sort of lends itself towards these really fantastic and interesting colors. And especially when you get into these sections, I'm trying to find where it's more in the quarter. You get into these sections where he has a lot of these character interactions and dialogue, and it very much feels like right here, for example, if you look at the faces of these men, the way that they're rendered out, you can almost see a lot of the characters from Mobius kind of work, where it looks very similar to the kind of the facial structure, or like the paunchiness, or maybe the way that this man's face is laid out and constructed. It has a very kind of French feel to it. I'm not sure if I'm communicating exactly what I mean by French feel very well, but if you are familiar with the Mobius stuff, like this panel, for example, looks like it could be taken out of Inkall. Like the way, if you're familiar with Inkall and the way the Prez looks in Inkall, this literally looks like it could be a panel of the President from Inkall, and the way that these kind of guys are like sniveling and groveling, and their facial expressions. He really, I think, uses that French influence to inform the way he does his character interactions and the way he designs his characters. So it's not just kind of the talking head action of American comics. It really has a flow and a dynamic expression that French comics, highlight and use to a really large extent, especially, like I was saying, the work of Mobius. And then lastly, sort of in the back half of this, you basically have the Miller style coming into play, like this right here. If you're familiar with Sin City, it looks like it could almost be a panel out of Sin City, with the way it's the just complete black inks contrasting with the white paneling, and it's sort of cutting the characters out of the shadows. Sort of in the latter third of the book, the characters get trapped in this kind of underground section of New York, and it really, really has a very strong Sin City vibe when he's drawing and rendering the underground section. There's a lot of play with, like I said, using basically shadows from like the light sources, sort of, to highlight the action and stuff like that. And the actual sort of underground people themselves have this feeling of like grossness and grittiness that Sin City would later have. And by the end of it, where you're looking at these panels, like these character designs and the way that they're laid out and the action is laid out then, really feels like Miller has come into his own kind of entity, and this is the style that he would refine further and further in The Dark Knight and in Sin City later. So I'm not going to go much further with the way the actual book ends, because that would sort of be spoiling, I think, a little more than you might want to see, especially some of these really amazingly fantastic ending sequences are very, very just awesome. I mean, it's really, really great. But I hope that I've illustrated at least somewhat my point that I was trying to make, that if you are interested in Frank Miller and seeing the influences that he absorbed in his time, reading and producing comics in the 70s, and what it ultimately became in his time writing comics in the late 80s into the 90s, I think this book is basically the be-all, end-all, the kind of the alpha and omega of understanding where these influences come from. You know, like I said, it has the pieces of Lone Wolf and Cub. It has the pieces of samurai and action and ninja manga in it, and then it also has on the other side the pieces of French and Belgian comics and their sort of surrealistic or whimsical portrayal of different fantastic and science fiction elements, and the way that he makes these different characters more interesting by sort of stealing or co-opting the kind of fluidity of design from guys like Mobius, and then ultimately we get to this point where he basically is pulling the ideas and the paneling of manga comics. Like if you look at this, it has that kind of, like I was talking before, like the choppy and kind of kinetic energy to it that Frank Miller's known for. But then at the same time, it's using the rendering and the creativity in the character designs and the way it kind of cuts space and light and darkness of French and European comics. So I really, really think that if you are remotely interested in Frank Miller, Ronin is almost... I don't think it's as far as you need to go, because I think that Dark Knight Returns has an equally important place. But if you were to get Ronin and Dark Knight Returns, I think you would have a great understanding of why this guy had so much, you know, respect and attention attached to his name, and why people have a vested interest in seeing him now return to form to some extent, I guess. You know, they want to see something like this again because they know what Miller can do, and I think a lot of the stuff that he has done in recent years has dissatisfied people that know him for this kind of work and really feel like this was something special and Dark Knight Returns was something special, and there's a place for this kind of fusings of East and West definitely in comics today. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, this new style of video. I think it's going to be a good way to highlight some of the books themselves a little bit more, and hopefully show my points about the art and the writing in different pieces a little more tangibly. You know, instead of me just talking about it and sort of holding them up, I hope that's a better way to see and understand what I'm talking about. This was a really fun one to do and break down because I think Ronin has so much stuff couched within it in terms of the influences that Frank Miller was showing. And it also is a really important book because it really blew the frickin' doors off of what could be possible to be published by the major publishers. You know, if you think about 1983, we're just about on the verge of a lot of the heavy UK authors coming out, like a lot of the people who really, a lot of, you know, the ones that I talk about a lot that pushed comics forward in a lot of people's minds. And Ronin was one of the things that sort of ushered in the age of feeling like, yeah, you can do this. You know, this was published by DC. You know, it was a premiere 6-issue book, and it was totally creator driven and creator done. You know, and drawn, written, and inked by Miller, and then colored over by Lynn Varley, and it was so out there and wild for American comics at the time that I think it really made a lot of people stand up and take notice and see like, oh, you know, this is the possibilities that we could sort of do if we want to do these miniseries and these graphic novels and these contained stories. You know, we don't have to always be working on, you know, insert character XYZ here and just doing runs on that. You know, we can make something that's really our own and our own artistic vision. So I think a lot of the guys that came after Miller, a lot of the people that came in the late 80s and really defined comics, as well as Miller himself, you know, following up Ronin with Dark Knight and Sin City, I think this was the real starting point. And if you are into comics as a visual medium, a storytelling medium, and especially into the history and sort of the understanding of European and Asian and American comics sort of combining together, this is absolutely the book. You have to pick this up. You have to own this in some respect. You know, it doesn't matter if you're not willing to spring for the absolute or even the collected. This, in my opinion, is one of the most essential books to read if you want to understand the way that comics were influenced in the 80s and where they came to today, especially with creator-owned companies like Image and different creators trying to push their own types of graphic novels and stories instead of just working on runs. Like I said, this is where it starts. This is ground zero, in my opinion, for mainstream American comics becoming more expansive and weird and interesting. You know, Jack Kirby did stuff like this, arguably in the 70s with his Eternals and New Gods, where he was such a big talent that these publishers were like, come on in and do whatever the fuck you want, Kirby. Like, come on down and make the Fourth World Saga and write all of these different books, and we'll publish it because we want your name. You know, that existed before, but it was sort of within a similar framework of a lot of the stuff that had been worked on. And I think Ronin really busted down the doors for a lot of what people thought was possible in terms of mainstream comics. So this book, specifically The Absolute, gets 2 big thumbs up from me. I would absolutely recommend it to anyone. I think the $50 to $60 price point is totally reasonable for the content that you're getting here. But if you don't want to get an Absolute, like I said, there's other issues, or there's other ways to get it. The issues are still pretty available for not too bad. If you probably spend $30 for all 6, the trade paperback is really cheap, and the deluxe is there too. So absolutely, unequivocally, 100% from Nerdventures, Ronin, I think, is an essential piece of American comics canon, and you should be reading it now if you haven't already. And if you have already, then you should probably read it again, because it's really good. And it totally defines what Frank Miller is about, and I love it. Simple as that. Go read it right now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I think it's going to be a good example of what I'm striving for in the future. Please give me a subscribe if you enjoyed it and you'd like to see more content from me. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you disliked it, give it a thumbs down, and tell me what you'd like to see me improve or change in the video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Ronin in the comments. You know, is Frank Miller a total crackpot, or is he, you know, all that he is cracked up to be? You know, what is cracked about Frank Miller? He is somebody that garners a lot of interesting opinions, especially from the way that he has sort of, the comments that he's made and the way that he's approached comic book work in his later or more recent years now. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about Miller and his 80s output, and if you think it is overrated, or if you agree with some of the stuff that I've been talking about. Please let me know your opinions. I'd love to hear from you guys, and I hope you are looking forward to next week's review, and I'll see you then.